Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today in the Political Legacy of 2021, Reflections from Past COP Presidents and Climate Leaders. My name is Vanessa Pérez-Cirera, and I am the Deputy Lead of WWF's Global Climate and Energy Practice, and it is an honor to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Mr. Laurent Fabius, UNFCCC COP21 President and President of the Constitutional Council of France. Welcome, Mr. Fabius.
Hello.
Minister Carolina Schmidt, COP25 President and Chile's Minister of Environment. Carolina, a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here today.
Dr. Jonathan Pershing, Senior Advisor to U.S. Presidential Envoy on Climate. Dr. Pershing, welcome to this event today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Helen Mountford, she's Vice President in Climate Economics for the World Resources Institute. Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And finally, our own Manuel Pulgar-Vidal, COP20 President and WWF's Global Lead for Climate and Energy. We have very little time for this event, an hour roughly, and a fascinating topic to cover. So I will do my best to keep time tight and a lively conversation going. The dynamic for today is that we will make one round of targeted questions to our distinguished panelists, follow that with questions from the floor, and finalize with views from our panelists to what they have heard and any final reflections on how to powerfully extend the climate political momentum beyond 2021. Please feel free to type your question in the question space provided in the chat box as concretely, as directly as you can. Our team will be clustering them and selecting the targeted questions from our panelists. We'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. The objective of the event today is to outline how a powerful climate political legacy of 2021 could look like in the years to come. As you all know, on the one hand side, the first version of the 2021 UNFCCC NDC synthesis report has unequivocally demonstrated that current ambition is far from a 1.5-degree future we all share, making it most relevant to maintain a strong political momentum during 2021. However, COP26 must not only be a checkpoint for the first ratchet cycle of the Paris Agreement, but should also lay ahead powerful conditions and a clear pathway for the next 5 years to come. These 5 years will constitute the make or break of effective implementation. Mr. Fabius, I would like to start with you. How do you see climate politics 6 years after the Paris Agreement? What has changed in the world? And what are the new challenges COP26 faces and that the climate regime must address? Mr. Fabius, over to you.
First, hello, and I'm very happy to be with colleagues and friends. And thank you to Manuel, particularly, because he had this very good idea, especially in this week, which will be an important week for climate, fight against climate change. Well, the question is very large, and because of short time, I will go only to one or two main points. First, you are right to say, Vanessa, that the situation is not good. When you are looking at the figures, I mean the actual figures and not the speeches, we are far from the commitments of Paris. Obviously, the situation is not the same as in Paris. I used to say that Paris was possible because there was the conjunction between three planets: scientific planet, civil society planet, and government planet. As far as scientific and technological planet is concerned, today things are pretty good, and there have been improvements which are impressive. Okay. As far as the civil society, I mean, non-state actors are concerned, there is a growing awareness and a lot of very good things which are done. Okay, bravo. But, with an enormous but, as far as the governments are concerned, we are far from the commitments. The NDCs are not good, they have to be enhanced. There are a lot of speeches about climate change, but as far as action is concerned, it's not very good. Recently, we had some good news, and particularly the fact that President Biden has decided to join again the Paris Agreement. There are some decisions which are announced which are pretty good, but still we are far from the commitments. And the report, the Global Energy Review, which has been published yesterday by International Energy Agency, is pretty bad. I mean, the results are pretty bad. 2021 will be a very bad year, probably. And therefore, we have to react. And it will be my conclusion. First, the end goal for this year is to have in November a very productive COP in Glasgow. That is the main goal. And we have to focus our energy on that, first. And second, as far as it is possible, during that COP, before the COP, after the COP, we have to be a bit more clearer than usually on the next steps. And in particular, we have in 2023 to prepare the stock take, in 2025 the new NDCs, and a series, obviously, of preparation of the future. But I insist on the fact that the motto for this year is implementation, which means NDC, which means finance, which means technology, which means not only mitigation but adaptation. You know that by heart. I insist on that. 2021 must be the year of implementation. Full stop.
Thank you, Mr. Fabius. That is very clear for the world. So no more empty promises. We have to be walking the talk, definitely. Carolina, Minister Schmidt, could you please share with us, and this might be a difficult question for you, of course, what are the main challenges and lessons of leading a COP? But in this context, particularly for recommendations that you'll have for the Conference of the Parties over the next 5 years. What do they need to achieve? What would be your top recommendations to keep momentum over the next 5 years? And in the light of also what Mr. Fabius has just said, in the light of effective implementation. Over to you, Minister Schmidt.
Thank you, Vanessa. And, all my regards to Manuel and Laurent, and to have the possibility to speak here, not with speeches, but with the real things. And I think that is very important, because we have a lot of opportunities to hear speeches, but what we need really, is to address the big issues that are behind the process. First, I want to remember that the process must be based in confidence, in trust. And we must go there, because there are certain issues that have affected the trust in the multilateral process, and we need to recover that trust. One of the issues is the accomplish of the pre-2020 commitments from developed countries, and that affects the confidence of different parties in the process. And secondly, is the issue that one of the main parts of the process, and one of the boosters of the Paris Agreement, the United States, when announced that they were coming out of the process, affect the trust of the other parties, and everybody start looking for their own interest instead of having, a common goal. We must remember that the principle of the Paris Agreement is that we have common but differentiated responsibilities. And that is something central to the process. So what we have, I would say, the challenge that we have is to recover confidence in the process, in one common goal. And that is the main issue for implementation, as Laurent was saying. Today, what we see is that we are far away to accomplish the goal of the Paris Agreement. And what we need is to recover that trust, and that requires strong political work. We cannot leave the situation under negotiators. After the Paris Agreement, what we saw, we have a process at the, COP21, that most of the work was on negotiators that were able to negotiate the rule book for the Paris Agreement. But what we see is not the need of more the work of negotiators only. We need the political will to make the implementation possible. And that means ambitious NDCs and long-term climate strategy with concrete plans. As Laurent was saying, what we learned in the process is something similar what is happening now with the COVID-19. If you hear Noah Harari said that COVID-19 show us that this has been a massive, we'll say, success of the scientific world, but a massive and loss of the political work. And I think in the process, we are having something similar. We have the scientific world very strong and very clear about the goals that we have to reach, but we are a lack of political will to implement the Paris Agreement. And in that sense, I look with very good eye to situations that I think can help us and to implementation to have a successful COP26. One is the situation of the United States, what the Joe Biden government is doing right now to, strongly show their commitment in the process is essential. In that sense, the travel of John Kerry to China to really make this change is very important in order to rebuild trust of the different parties in the process. Secondly, we have the COVID situation that is affecting all the world, and that also make the political people to come to the process in order to have the implementation, the real implementation of the Paris Agreement, the NDCs and the long-term strategy to be part of the solution of the recovery of the COVID-19. We need that work back, and I think this is some of the main issues that we have to learn in the process to rebuild this confidence, to show a common but differentiated responsibility in order to really change the things around implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Carolina, Minister Schmidt. So concrete policies, political leadership across the board, trust, and then of course connection to the concrete reality that we are living. And I think this makes a great bridge to Helen. So Helen, in this context and what you've heard so far from Mr. Fabius and Minister Schmidt, what are the real economy enabling conditions for the success of the Paris Agreement, and vice versa? How do we create that virtuous interaction or loop? How far you think we are from having an optimal virtuous loop between the real economy and the Paris Agreement? And connected to this, what do you think are the needed breakthroughs that will allow this virtual cycle to work properly? Some of them will be needed in 2021. Some of them might happen in the years to come. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And I'd love to build on what Monsieur Fabius said, as well as some of the points you made at the start. I do think we're seeing a sort of virtuous policy ambition loop, right? Climate ambition loop that is potential. There is a real potential there between what cities and states are doing, what businesses, investors are doing, what civil society is doing, and what governments are doing. But we're not yet making all the right connections between this ambition loop to make it, to ensure it delivers what we need. So if I could just go back a step, you mentioned the recent UN synthesis report, and Mr. Fabius also mentioned how far off we are in terms of the government targets for 2030, the NDC enhancement. We're really far off where we need to be. At the same time, what we are seeing is there's been incredible momentum around the world around net zero targets, the longer term 2050, for some countries before 2050, targets on when they plan to get their full economy to net zero. And I think this is one of the pieces of the puzzle that we need to really sort of draw on and leverage to actually get what we need by Glasgow. So we now have over 50% of global emissions in countries with over 50% of global emissions that have committed to net zero targets. But those aren't yet turning into the near-term trajectories that we need to see. So what we need to do is bring those down into the near term. We're also seeing this in terms of what's happening with companies, with investors, with others. And the climate champions teams are really doing a push for this year to try and see if we can get 30% of major sectors, the companies, the investors in major sectors, cities, to actually commit to net zero targets. It's the race to zero. We're also doing a race to resilience to really emphasize what we need on adaptation. And how are we seeing that going? So in terms of companies, we've now got over 1,300 companies with a combined market capitalization of over $15 trillion. So that's including about a fifth of the global Fortune 500 that have committed to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in line with what the science says is needed. And they're building out the specific trajectories and pathways they need to get there between now and 2050. So they're building those out. We've also seen a recent wave from the investor community. So we've got now, with recent announcements by BlackRock and Vanguard, we have 73 asset managers, major asset managers from around the world that have committed to net zero across their portfolio by 2050. Again, this represents $35 trillion in assets under management, which is about 1/3 of all of our global assets that are committed to trajectories to net zero by 2050. So we're seeing some incredible momentum now building in terms of company action, in terms of investor action. What we need to do is get this behind the countries, and the countries willing to come forward now and actually set their trajectories to get to net zero. Not just to come forward with the net zero targets, but what will they do in 2030? How will they align them? The report you referenced at the start, the new UN synthesis report, that definitely shows we're not on track for the NDCs yet, the 2030 targets yet for countries, but actually about countries responsible for about 75% of global emissions haven't yet announced their 2030 targets. So we're very much hoping that those 75%, the emissions, 75% of emissions, those countries will be coming forward this week or soon and announcing more ambitious targets, particularly because a number of them, including the US, and Jonathan, we're really looking forward to what the US is going to be saying this week. But the US, we have Canada, South Korea, Japan, China, all of them have set net zero targets for 2050 or for 2060 for China, but haven't yet announced their updated 2030 targets. So we need to get those 2030 targets locked in. What does that trajectory look like to net zero? How can they build on the fact that the finance community is shifting, the business community is shifting? How can they realize that? Do that this year. And aligned with that, how do they actually ensure what they're doing now, what governments are doing now to build back from the COVID-19 economic crisis and health crisis, what they're doing now actually aligns to start putting them in the right way? And certainly some of the initiatives we've seen in the last couple of weeks coming out here in the US, but also in some other countries around the world, are really looking at how you can do that green recovery in a way which delivers jobs, which delivers health benefits, which boosts the economy and competitiveness. but also puts you on the right track for really delivering on climate commitments. So there's a lot of momentum this year to build on. There's a lot more that's going to be needed still. We know at Glasgow, even under the best situation, we're still going to need to close the gap further, both on mitigation in terms of reducing emissions, but also importantly on continuing to ensure the finance is flowing to support developing countries in their efforts to move towards low carbon economies and to build the resilience and the adaptation that they need. So there will still need to be more, and we'll need to set that trajectory through for the next few years at Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So a lot of expectations on a couple of commitments and announcements that will happen this year, and definitely your point about the context, particularly around finance, very much aligning to the Paris Agreement and increasingly doing so. So that is a very important point to take into account. Manuel, how do you see the role of COP26 in the Paris Agreement ratchet cycle? What is the role of COP26 in your view? And in what does the future of the climate regime, in your view, should look like to ensure this effective implementation and that we align the world to the promise of Paris? Over to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to you all, good friends, and thank you to join this important panel to discuss the legacy of COP26. So to go to your question, let me start by putting in front of all the audience what it is a factual evidence. We are in a strong, high momentum. It is incredible. 2 days ahead of the summit, 2 days ahead of the Earth Day. It is also after some days of this US-China statement, it is clear that we are building a strong momentum, and what it is good. But it is interesting to recognize that 5.5 months ago, we were in a complete different situation. The day of the election of the US, it was the time in which I think it was a day after the US formalized the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement, a time in which we were more probably discouraged of what it could happen. So it is amazing how much it has been built in 5.5 months. And why I am bringing these two facts, no? November 2020, April 2021, and how quick things have changed. Because that is why the importance to talk about a legacy. And that is why the importance of thinking what it could be, what COP26 could achieve or must achieve, and what are the legacy that should live to the future. So I am going to answer your question based on those two facts. So in my point of view, when we think about legacy, immediately I am thinking about three components. And those components in some way have been brought to the table by Laurent, by Helen, by Carolina. So the first one, it is clearly implementation. The point it is that we are here to implement. That should be our key task, our key achievement, to implement the Paris Agreement with all what does it mean. No, I am going to make some reflections about that implementation. But a second one, and also it is related to some questions that are appearing in the Q&A, it is to keep the multilateralism, the importance of continue having countries around this multilateral process, taking decisions, implementing, and moving the process forward. Something that in the current times, it is very difficult because of pandemics. Many people is wondering what it could happen because of pandemics in sense of virtual negotiation, what it should be a decision in relation to a physical COP by November, or if it should be again postponed. I am sure that the UK presidency is going to take the most accurate decision based in the importance of keeping multilateralism and a fair and equitable access for every country, the 200 countries, into the table. But that is something that we should leave to the UK presidency. It will be a difficult decision, but it is important to keep that multilateralism. But the third one, and I think that Carolina mentioned it, it is that also this COP should help to recover hope in the process. Also should be a tool or an instrument to bring back the clarity on the process. Because as probably you have already heard me, it is clear that currently people who are used to analyzing COPs, journalists, are thinking that COPs are a single event in a single year. And that is not correct. In my point of view, the COP, it is an event, an annual event that could add strong things in a gradual process in which we are building things toward a main and collective objective. And we do need to recover that sense, because if not, we will continue ending every COP by saying disappointing, 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 when probably it is not. I think that it was strongly unfair to Chile and to Carolina that phrase, because I think that Chile made not only good efforts, but also achieved strong outcomes that move the process again one step towards the next. So that sense of clarity, it is for me really important, but also the credibility. And I am going to mention credibility in some more concrete way. So those three elements, implementation, multilateralism, and hope, credibility, and clarity of the process are for me the three main elements of what it could be seen as legacy. And to do that, and tell me, Vanessa, if I am taking too much time, let me be verbally graphic. No, in my point of view, what COP could achieve, it is a balance in between global decisions and domestic actions, because implementation is that. It is a combination of domestic actions based in global decisions that are bringing some mandates to be executed and to be implemented, not only by country and its government, but also subnational government, non-state actors, among some others. So in relation to the global and what it should be achieved in COP26, we know that there are regular tasks. We know things around Article 6. We know that it should address what it is related to the rule book, also things related to adaptation, and among finance, and we are expecting to have a clear fulfillment of the 100 billion, and all of that probably everybody that it is involved in this process knows very well. But the point it is what else it could do, how much clarity it could give to the next step of the process. Because my point it is how much the momentum of 2021 could give enough air for 2022, 2023, 2024 to keep that ratchet mechanism strongly alive. And that is why I am strongly thinking on some way of legacy, some roadmap, something that it could give that kind of clarity as part of a successful COP26. Because if not, it could be again, no? We have already suffered the roller coaster of having a strong COP21 in Paris, and then because of political situation, not a backslide, but all that effort and all that momentum, it was almost lost. Now we are recovering that. The point is, how can we promote a more stable political system through the COPs? But it is not just that. Also, I think that this COP could really help to scale up the role of the non-state actors, because action is happening. The point it is how, and let me say something that it is difficult to say. For me, climate action, it is a combination again of formal public participation, so parties' decision, and action by the actors, business sectors, civil society, subnational government. So the point is that the non-state actors agenda, seen as that well-balanced in between public decision and private action, it should be kept by scaling it up. We do need to scale up the action agenda to give a new impulse to it. I remember well, Laurent, when we launched in the beginning the Lima Paris Action Agenda, that I think it was a great decision. Now we are in a time in which that agenda must be scaled up, relaunched, to give a new impulse that it could be enough for the next 4 or 5 years. And for sure, all of those global actions must encourage countries not only to put their NDCs on the table and the long-term strategy, but encourage them to implement it, to track progress, to see how much they are fulfilling with what they have put on the table. That is something, Jonathan, that we talked some months ago. The importance of having coalitions in the domestic level that can engage different actors to encourage our government to fulfill with their task. Because in developing countries, that is not happening as strong as it should be. So A good legacy of a COP26, it is not only to encourage, but to define good mechanism or to talk about good mechanism to move all of this into the domestic level, to ground it into the subnational, into the civil society, into the business sector. Because the action agenda, it is not just about the largest corporation, multinational corporation of the world. It is about domestic companies. So that is something that probably it is still pending. So a good legacy of COP26 could also focus on that. So I hope that I have organized well my ideas around your question, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Very, very, very interesting. And I think it also connects very well to the next question to Dr. Pershing in the sense of connecting and grounding. And so I would like to ask Dr. Pershing, what is the US perspective on COP26 in relation to global climate policy, but also how does this connect to other processes like MEF, the G7, the G20, and what is the expected role that the US is expecting to have in this year vis-a-vis these processes? Over to you, Dr. Pershing.
So thanks very much, Vanessa, and it's a pleasure to be with you at this panel and this discussion. Maybe I'll start off with some historical characterization. I've actually had the great privilege of being at all of the COPs since the INC in 1989. And what's really interesting to me is how it's evolved and shifted over time. When we began, and it's 30 years ago, so it's not just yesterday, but it's also not so long, we had only first set out the scope and the scale of the problem. We were beginning to identify that there was something serious that the world had to grapple with. At the first meeting, which was actually held in Washington in 1990, we had a very small session just outside of the Dulles airport. And only a handful of people, we had only several hundred people came to that meeting. And I look at the meeting in Paris and where we were when we had 30,000 people come and global leaders from around the world were now paying attention and shaping the outcome. To me, this is a progression that's continued. And I think that Helen framed it extremely well in the commentary about what share of global assets are now engaged in this conversation. A third of all global assets under management are now moving forward. That's a trajectory that's remarkable. We have no other event, no other sequence of change in the last 30 years that comes close. Nothing else that we can kind of point to that suggests this kind of commitment or engagement. I agree with Laurent that this is not sufficient. The answer is that we haven't yet resolved the issues. So to me, this is a year that in some ways is a milestone. It's a marker. What are we trying to change? What's the new course that we are trying to set? And I would argue it falls into a couple of small but significant categories. The first, we now have to grapple with the fact that we were a little bit optimistic in the expectations of temperatures that we had to meet. We thought it was going to be sufficient to turn the temperature dial, so we only had an increase of 2 degrees. It's become clear with the IPCC report of a couple of years ago that we need to move towards 1.5. That shift is significant because it also suggests a long-term trajectory. It is no longer sufficient to have an incremental change. We need the world to be on a trajectory to zero net emissions by the middle of the century. I would argue it's 2050. That in turn shapes the outcome that we need to have in this decade. It's not going to be likely that we will end up with a deep decarbonization pathway by 2050 unless we move immediately. And that in turn shapes this COP and this year. This is a moment where we no longer have the luxury of waiting. We have to see much more immediate action. So in the US's view, this is going to be shaped by a series of commitments. It's the updated NDCs that Helen spoke about. We don't have enough, we need to have more. They need to be tangible and specific. We need also at this moment to begin to intersect and create the connections between the politics of the COP and the reality of business and the opportunities on the ground. And this is my second point. This is no longer an option that speaks to an environmental community or a narrow constituency. This is an exercise that brings in whole of government, that brings heads of state, that brings business communities and society at large. But this is also a window of opportunity. this is the way the world is going, there are enormous numbers of new jobs. It's a very clear progression into a better global economy, one that's more resilient to all sorts of shocks, one that provides for clean air and clean water, as well as a better climate and a successful and stable future. It's one that gives us opportunity for global trade and economic development, not just in a handful of countries, but across nations, and also within countries to look at those who are most sorely affected and who have historically been marginalized. That's a rather extraordinary agenda. And then finally, it brings me to the question of what happens specifically. We need to work with countries, both those that are already acting but insufficiently, and the lessons from those who are acting and understand what the trajectory is and bring it to the global community, and use this meeting and this COP and all of the events that run up to it, such as the UN General Assembly, such as the meeting of the Major Economies Forum, such as the meeting of the G20, such as the meeting of the OAS, our own meeting coming up later this week on the climate summit that President Biden is hosting. These are opportunities for countries to step forward, for civil society to step forward and take these new actions, and then in this year to implement them to change the course that we are currently on to be more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pershing. I think so many ideas and connected to each other. So we will try to start answering some questions from the floor. Probably I will start with Mr. Fabius and some of the remarks made by other panelists around the pandemic, how to sort the pandemic. So as we see these assets starting to be aligned at a major level, right? As never before, as Jonathan and Helen mentioned. But on the other hand, we still see fossil fuel subsidies in numbers that are probably unbearable, really, in this reality, and also recovery packages that are not aligned. So I would like to have Mr. Fabius' point of view, how to tackle a successful COP in this pandemic era, both in terms of connecting the different processes at hand, but also just facing the very particular challenges of face-to-face meetings versus virtual meetings. How does he see this dynamic forward, and how can this be sorted? Mr. Fabius, over to you.
Thank you. These are two very important but different points. First, as far as the recovery plans are concerned, it is true, and I appreciate what Jonathan has said, that there has been a major shift. In fact, today, nearly every single country through the world agrees on the long-term objective. Most of us are speaking about carbon neutrality in 2050. China, up to now, says 2060. But whatever is the moment, it's very spectacular. It's very important that all of us, all the nations, are saying now, in the long term, we must achieve carbon neutrality. And that's very good. But, and there is an enormous but, what happens in between? What about 2030? And what about today? And therefore, we have to insist not only on the long-term perspective, but on the short-term perspective. And it's where the recovery plans interfere. In the different countries, we are relaunching the economic machinery with money, 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 and money in order to have an economic development after the virus. And it goes through finance, it goes through banks, it goes through IMF, it goes to World Bank. And therefore, I think we must pay great attention and take decisions regarding this international financial system in order that the recovery plans will be at the same time plans which fight against climate change. There is not, on the one hand, recovery plans, and on the other hand, climate change. No, they have to be interwoven, and therefore we must intervene through our financial institutions and through our financial ministers. I remember that before Paris agreement, we have gathered the ministers throughout the world in charge of finance and explained to them that it was their task, and we must do the same this year through G7, through G20, through IMF meeting, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I insist on that. Second point, what about the fact that because of the COVID, it could be difficult to have an in-person Glasgow summit. Like everybody, I consider that the fact that we have to have a face-to-face diplomacy is of the greatest importance. Here, we're happy to have this meeting through Zoom, but with Zoom, you cannot really reach the solutions which are necessary for a successful COP. Because in a COP, and my colleagues know that by heart, what is important, it's not only the official speeches, it is the speeches which take place between ministers, between specialists in the lobbies. And therefore, I strongly insist on the fact that before Glasgow, and if possible in Glasgow, we must make our utmost effort in order to have a face-to-face summit, because there is a close relationship between this, I would say, technical element and the final outcome. And I insist too on the fact that the presidency of the COP, and my fellows are there to bear witness to that, you are not representing your country. No, no, no. You are representing the multilateralism and you're representing the world. And therefore, it's an absolute necessity to have many and many discussions with every single country throughout the world. Not only the big ones, but also the intermediate ones and the small ones. They have a particular importance. Therefore, these were my two answers.
Thank you, Mr. Fabius. Definitely the two very relevant and very separate questions. Helen, just quickly on this positive loop between what we're seeing in the financial assets, the private finance piece of things, and then the public finance. And I think that connection in the right level and with the right guidance, I would say. I think the EU taxonomy is a great example on how you can use public funding to guide the private funding to the right places. What do you think it's needed on the one hand side to mainstream that portfolio alignment on the private sector, and it's kind of its optimal connection to the public finance piece? Over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I absolutely agree. I think we're seeing exciting momentum in terms of private finance and the shifts that it's making. We're not yet seeing enough of what we need on the public finance side. So just a couple of points on this and how they connect together. First, developed countries, the rich developed countries had committed that by 2020, they would be mobilizing $100 billion per year to support developing countries on what they need to do to adapt to the climate change impacts that are already hitting them, to build resilience and to help transition to a low carbon economy. Now we're in 2021 already. We know that we have not even close that gap to reach the 100 billion per year. The latest estimates that we saw were off track on that. And yet at the same time, we also know that was a floor. That's even nowhere near what we need to actually channel to support countries in the climate transition. We need more in the trillions. A lot of that's going to be from the private sector. But we do need now, I think absolutely imperative now, is to have developed economies stepping up on the public finance to once and for all close that gap to the $100 billion. This gets back to a point that Minister Schmidt made. There has been a breakdown in trust over the last year or two in terms of between developed and developing countries, in terms of actually getting a whole package of ambition, support, and sort of prosperity for all in terms of what's delivered on climate. And right now, one of the major missing components is having sufficient public sector finance, step up to the plate internationally. So in addition to the commitments we're hoping to see coming forward soon on 2030 ambition from major countries, the US, Canada, we're also looking to them, to France and Japan, to Germany, to others, to come forward and step up some of their climate finance, particularly finance that is given in the form of grants, not just loans. So those are the kinds of commitments we need to see coming forward from the public sector, from these developed economies in terms of public finance to really show that they are stepping up to the table. Interestingly, I mean, we talked about how many countries have already committed to net zero and have delivered more enhanced NDCs to align with this target. A lot of those were already the vulnerable and developing countries that stepped up to the plate early and showed leadership because they knew there was no alternative. But now we need to make sure we've got the finance to support them as they move forward. In terms of the link to the private sector, I think one of the really interesting shifts that we've been seeing recently is that insurance companies, private finance has been fleeing rapidly away from any investments in coal. And we've seen even just a report yesterday just about the amount that's needed to bring insurance companies to the table to back coal projects. So they've been fleeing from coal. They're increasingly thinking twice about any projects around oil and gas, pipelines, et cetera. So you're starting to see the private sector really shifting. I think one of the things we need to look to in countries is how can governments actually learn from what's happening in the private sector and not start to build out massive new pipelines or investments in new oil, gas, infrastructure, or even coal in some countries, when we're actually seeing the private sector move so quickly away. What we don't want is in 5-10 years, these have been built out and the government is left holding the full purse because the private sector is not willing to participate. So governments really need to be watching what's happening in the private sector, learning from it, and actually moving soon and early to support instead the transition, right? A just transition for coal, oil, gas workers, for those communities away from those sectors. They are not sectors that are going to be continuing long into the future. How do we help the workers, the communities shift to something that is different, other employment, more diversified economies? That's where we should be spending government domestic dollars rather than on continuing to provide the high fossil fuel subsidies that you mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Very, very clear points. Carolina, back to you and this graduality that Manuel mentioned. So in your view, what are these key elements of this graduality to move from COP25 and moving into COP26 in terms of the key mandates to continue that graduality and also a way of communicating to the world clearly that we are actually making progress every time we meet. It's a temperature check of what the world is looking like, but also it's making progress in the multilateral regime. Over to you, Carolina.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we understand that we need to reach always a balanced package. And in that sense, all the work must, go in that direction. And I come back to this central principle of the Paris Agreement of common but differentiated responsibilities. When you need and you know the agenda of a COP, and the COP26 agenda is very heavy. It's a strong agenda. You have several issues. You must understand that all these issues are connected. And when you speak about Article 6. It is connected to finance for adaptation. It is connected also to resources for mitigation. It's connected with transparency. So everything is connected. You cannot think of different issues in the negotiation as different issues, with different negotiation teams that go and address each of them. And that is why it's so important, this political will in order to address consensus in this balanced package. We have a strong agenda in order to keep momentum for COP26. One of the agenda, we know that we have to adapt it to the COVID-19 circumstances. So we have to maximize progress and minimize delays, and we have worked with the Bureau and the COP in order to do so. We have the SB, we have extend a week for the SBs this year, as Laurent was saying, the importance of physical presence meeting is essential, but now we cannot do these presential meetings. So what we are doing is really to build the momentum through different moments during the year. And in that sense, what I was saying, according to this meeting with the US, where you can build momentum with strong commitments from the different countries to build now, because what we're saying, we have built a common agreement on the carbon neutrality in 2050. And when we launched during the UN, the UN presidency, the Climate Ambition Alliance for Carbon Neutrality in 2050, now we have more than 123 countries committed to carbon neutrality in 2050, but also we committed the private sector in a strong way in that alliance. But the first alliance that brings together state actors and non-state actors committed with concrete plans for carbon neutrality in 2050. And for the first time, bring all the investors. So what we're saying today is what we're seeing, that the money for carbon neutrality in 2050 is already there, more than $30 trillion committed with concrete plans for carbon neutrality in 2050. So the importance now is how we get those into the implementations in concrete action now, because we have the agreement on 2050, but we need now in the NDCs and the long-term strategies to put that in the recovery plans from COVID, so we can see now the progress. And so all the work now through COP26 must be focused, on getting the recovery plans in the NDC's commitment, so we can see now the changes that we are seeing in the private sector with concrete plans to bring this carbon neutrality to the reality now.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Back to Manuel, and then finally with Dr. Pershing. Manuel, we have had several questions about nature-based solutions. How can we bring nature-based solutions clearly into COP26? And also, how can we better connect the twin biodiversity and climate COP moments occurring this year? Manuel, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. That is an extremely interesting question, the two of them. It is clear, and thanks to Chile, nature-based solution has been already recognized in a COP. Chile, in one of their decisions, Chile COP25, defined nature-based solutions as part of the Standing Committee on Finance, and that was a first step towards more. And nature-based solution has been prioritized by the presidency of COP26. So it is clear that nature-based solution has come to stay with us as a tool, as a solution. But that probably it is not enough, because we are talking about a concept that it is still under development. It is an ongoing concept. I think that IUCN is strongly working well, not only in defining well what does it mean nature-based solution, they have also released some indicators under the name of a standard, but probably we should continue moving this process forward, because if we are talking about a solution, it should be clear for the different actors that could apply it, or countries to include it into their own NDCs. So let me make a couple of reflections on what it should be those next steps in relation to nation-based solution. And let's start by thinking that when we talk about nation-based solutions, we are talking about three main values. The value of the societal challenge that the nation-based solutions is planning to address, that it could be climate, it could be water security, food security, risk management. So that is the first value. The second value is the sustainable use of nature. And when we think of sustainable use of nature, we are expecting to have a biodiversity net gain. And the third one are the co-benefits. And those are, I'm not sure if this is an English word, preclusive. So if your intervention on nature, it is not addressing any societal challenge, it is not a nature-based solution. And it is important to mention that because I think that currently we are moving our actions with a strong confusion on what does it mean. And everybody thinks that any intervention on nature, it is nature-based solution. That is not correct. So that most accurate framing for nature-based solution, it is something that we should continue working as a way to make it as an effective tool. But let me move into a second reflection, because I mentioned in my first intervention credibility. Still, we are discussing what does it mean, this concept of net zero. No, many organizations are defining exactly what does it mean net zero. SBTI is working on that. World Economic Forum is working on that. And many organizations trying to develop, okay, how it could be a credible climate claim. No, also because everybody is using a different claim. Climate neutrality, carbon neutrality, net zero. The point is, how can we really promote a strong credibility on what does it mean, and how by that credibility we can track progress on how much the agenda it is advancing. The point is that in that dilemma, in that discussion, also there is a discussion on what is the role that nature could play in relation to the net zero. Some actors are saying that it could play a role just for residual emissions. Some others, when we are referring to the target of countries, are saying that it could be key, as for example, countries in the tropical areas of the world that has as a main source of emission deforestation and land use should use it as a main tool. So all of that discussion, it is an ongoing, and we should keep it and move it forward. But that moves me to the third reflection, and I am going to be short, because the second, this question, it has been raised by Christian Samper. Le mando un saludo a Christian. But my third element in relation to nature-based solutions, it is, and so climate could continue in their decisions adopting nature-based solutions as a concept and giving more clarity. But what it should be done by the CBD, because it is extremely interesting that there are some resistance in the CBD community to adopt nature-based solutions as a concept, because they are putting like in a competition nature-based solutions versus ecosystem approach. And in my humble point of view, they are perfectly complementary. Because if the CBD knows that the second value, it is biodiversity net gain, and it is a sustainable intervention on nature, the CBD should focus on that value and should define principles to define what does it mean a sustainable intervention on nature. So CBD could really get benefits of nature-based solutions for the fulfillment of their own objective as a convention. So that is something that we should continue working on. I think that the CBD don't need to define targets, because the targets are referring to the societal challenge. I am not sure if I am enough clear on what I am saying, but what we do need it is to really create a complementary interlink in between CBD and climate in relation to nature-based solution. And because I know that the next is going to be Jonathan, I would like to also make a last reflection on one phrase. You know that somebody put on the Q&A that we are, and it was for you, Helen, that there are many actions, and probably we are living under what, who made the question called a Paris effect, no? What I think it is a good concept. I am wondering if we are still under a Paris effect, or if we are really entering into the elements of a new economy, of a new climate economy, no? I am more sure that the world has already entered into a new economic system in which climate is playing a key role. Probably we have just made the first modest step, but we have entered into. And that is key for me, because that could move developing countries, that could move different actors into recognizing why they should be part of all these kind of actions. What do you think, Jonathan? Are we entering? Have we already entered into new climate economy? Exist those elements to think that climate economy is existing? And sorry, Vanessa, that I am making but this question.
Go on, Dr. Pershing. That is very linked to what I was going to answer. So just related to Manuel's question in this new economy. Also, there were several questions about the role that price or regional or border tax adjustments or other bilateral or multilateral groups of agreements at another level will play in this new economy. So what do you think? Are we entering, and how do the different pieces of this economy look like, if it's not a too big of a question? Over back to you.
So thanks, Vanessa, and thanks very much, Manuel. I think there's a very interesting framing that you put on the table. Is this a climate economy or not? You could make a rather different case. You could make the case that, in fact, this is an evolution that's quite natural. This is a new set of risks that we are facing, and we are adjusting and adapting accordingly. Are we in a world in which we are urbanizing because of climate? No, but the consequence of climate and urbanization will lead to certain kinds of development. Are we in a world in which global population expansion is driven by climate? No. But as that expansion continues, we have to think about how we supply the needs for billions of people in a sustainable manner. I think we're looking at a series of risks and adjustments that society is making. I think we're looking at a series of opportunities that we will look to for the continuation of the welfare of the people of our countries and the global community. Those have to include the nature-based solutions that you've framed. They have to include the ecosystems that we all talk about. It's this integrated question, but it doesn't live in a vacuum. It doesn't live in isolation. I think Carolina's comments earlier that she was talking about the COVID and the recovery, that's also part of the world that we live in today. If I look at the competition globally around trade, that is also part of today's world. Thinking about these in conjunction, as opposed to trying to pull them apart and say, this lives all by itself, it's a climate changed world that we live in, I think misses the integration and the interconnectedness. And it seems to me that that's also where the solution lies. If we try to separate it out and say, I will fix climate independently of thinking about jobs, independently of thinking about equity, independently of thinking about financial development, I think we will fail. If we put the pieces together, if we think about COVID recovery and can we make that greener, if we think about jobs and distribution and make that more equitable, if we think about land and the management of ecosystems and integrate that into our world, I think we will be much more successful. To me, climate is one of a set of problems. It connects to all the other problems that we are facing. The solution is likely to be one that ties them together. One of the things that I think is exciting is that you now are operating at the right political level across the world that could actually solve this. It is no longer a ministry by itself. It's no longer only a junior person in an engineering team in a company. It's a CEO, it's a head of state, it's a corporate leader, it's a civil society leader. They're now all at the table. That's unique, and to me gives me a great deal of optimism that we're on a trajectory that's much more promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pershing. So unfortunately, time has run out and I don't have the luxury of asking for final remarks from our panelists, but I just would very, very, very much like to thank you for this fantastic discussion. I hope we continue to have these discussions bilaterally and in every occasion that we can. Would like to thank again very much everyone for participating, Mr. Laurent Fabius, Minister Carolina Schmidt, Dr. Jonathan Pershing, Helen Mountford, and Manuel for a fantastic panel and for your time today. Thank you very much all.
Thank you to you all, friends.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.